Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to dive into a topic that's been dominating the headlines lately. But we're going to tackle it a little differently. We're stepping completely away from the political rhetoric, and instead, we're looking strictly at the hard data. We want to understand the true macroeconomic reality behind the socio-political movements happening right now in South Africa. Because if you really want to grasp the true impact of anti-immigration campaigns, you've got to follow the numbers.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our roadmap today starts at the hyperlocal level of jobs and expands outward, kind of like a giant ripple effect. We'll start with the epicenter, then hit crime and stability, move on to the national economy, regional dominance, and finally wrap up with the overarching macro impact.
Section 1. The epicenter, the campaign, and jobs.
So to understand the epicenter of this friction, we first need to define what we're actually looking at. The March or Match-to-Match campaigns are movements protesting against illegal immigration. Their core argument is that foreign nationals are illegally taking jobs or operating businesses at the direct expense of South African citizens. On the flip side, critics argue that these actions simply spark xenophobia and social tension. Now, we aren't taking any political sides here today. Our goal is simply to lay the groundwork and measure what actually happens when these tensions flare up.
And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of the situation. When we look at the actual demographics of the employed workforce, a completely different picture emerges. Over 90%, 91% to be exact, are South African-born. Foreign workers make up only 8 to 9% of the employed workforce. And the data shows they're predominantly operating in low-skilled sectors, things like agriculture, construction, and informal retail. This is a crucial detail because it doesn't really support the popular narrative that foreign nationals are the primary drivers behind massive, widespread unemployment.
But when these anti-immigration campaigns gain momentum, they create very real, very localized effects. What the data reveals is that when you disrupt these migrant-run businesses, it actually ends up harming local township economies. You see the immediate closure of small, informal businesses that provide essential, everyday goods, which in turn drags down overall local economic activity. On top of that, formal businesses face higher costs and sudden hiring challenges. So the friction that's intended to protect local economies often ends up squeezing them even tighter.
Section 2. The first ripple. Crime and stability.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it ties into arguably the most volatile claim of these campaigns, the idea that undocumented migrants drive crime. But let's look at the official correctional services data to see who is actually locked up. South African citizens make up 89.5% of the prison population. Foreign nationals account for just 10.5%. And honestly, depending on the year and the counting method, some government ministers have cited that figure being as low as 7.5%. So the consistent, undeniable picture here is that foreign nationals represent a surprisingly small minority of the incarcerated population.
However, we absolutely cannot ignore the larger context here. In 2026, South Africa recorded a severe crime index of 74.6. That ranks it as the 5th most dangerous country globally and the highest in all of Africa. The point we're making is that crime levels in South Africa are objectively severe across the board, completely regardless of who is actually committing the offenses.
So, why is it statistically problematic to blame one specific group? Well, think about these police detection rates. The South African Police Service is able to identify perpetrators in only 23.9% of murders. Let that sink in. That means for over 75% of murders, the police simply do not know who the perpetrators are. And the numbers are even worse for aggravated robberies. If you literally don't know who is committing over 3/4 of the most severe crimes, it's virtually impossible to assert that undocumented migrants are responsible for the vast majority of them.
Furthermore, the reality on the ground often directly contradicts public perception. A massive survey across Cape Town, Gauteng, and Durban involving over 1,000 shopkeepers revealed a striking paradox. Roughly half of those shopkeepers were foreigners, with Somali nationals actually being the second most common nationality after South Africans. And what did the data show? It showed that these foreign shopkeepers are disproportionately the victims of violent crime. They're the ones bearing the brunt of theft, arson, and murder, rather than being the perpetrators.
So, if immigration isn't the primary driver of crime, what is? Well, the data points to deep structural root causes. We're talking about chronic unemployment hovering around a staggering 32 to 33%. We're looking at entrenched gang networks, the heavy drug trade, alcohol abuse, and deeply organized corruption. But you know what the most tragic yet fascinating takeaway regarding these campaigns is? Xenophobic anger is often uniquely triggered when local municipal services fail. When the water stops flowing or the power gets cut, the frustration on the ground violently and suddenly shifts toward migrants.
Section 3. The second ripple, the national economy.
So, the crucial point is how that localized instability strikes right at the very heart of the national economy. Consider this massive number, 1.2 trillion rand. The South African government has this massive drive to mobilize 1.2 trillion rand in foreign investment. But analysts have strongly warned that even if the crime statistics don't support the xenophobic narrative, the mere perception of instability does massive, tangible economic damage. Xenophobic violence deeply deters investor sentiment and plummets tourist confidence. When factories and townships are disrupted, the global market is watching, and that trillion rand investment target is directly threatened. And we have to remember what actually drives this economy. Exports of goods and services account for a massive 31.85% of South Africa's total GDP as of 2024. This isn't just some side hustle for the nation. This export engine is the absolute cornerstone of the entire economy.
Let's break down exactly what makes up that export engine. You've got mineral products dominating at over 24%, followed by base metals, vehicles, machinery, chemicals, and agriculture. The really critical takeaway here is that every single one of these top sectors, mining, automotive, agriculture, is incredibly fragile when it comes to logistics. They depend entirely on completely stable, uninterrupted supply chains.
And to put that into perspective, look at the scale of the money we are talking about here. We are seeing a massive upward trajectory in export value, going from over 155,000 million rand in January 2026, jumping up to over 168,000 million in February, with projections hitting over 178,000 million by 2027. We are talking billions of rand on the line. Any localized unrest that disrupts cross-border logistics or transport labor directly threatens this entire growth curve.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. The outer ripple, regional dominance.
Stepping beyond South Africa's borders, we really have to ask, when those supply chains leave the country, where are they actually going? Well, a staggering 91% of South Africa's intra-African exports go directly to the SADC region, the Southern African Development Community. This includes everything from industrial goods to processed foods and textiles. South Africa relies incredibly heavily on its immediate neighbors to buy its goods.
But this creates a pretty massive diplomatic contradiction. On one hand, South Africa has these really aggressive goals to expand trade across the continent, boasting a recent 13% growth in African imports. On the other hand, xenophobic attacks have caused highly documented diplomatic damage with crucial trading partners like Nigeria. South Africa is trying to foster regional integration, but these internal campaigns are straining the exact relationships they absolutely rely on to grow their economy.
And the friction isn't just political, it's logistical. In response to these pressures, the Border Management Authority has deported a massive 500,000 people since April 2023. They're also actively overhauling their 6 busiest land ports. Now, while border enforcement is totally a government's right, increased enforcement at this immense scale inevitably adds severe, highly costly delays to the road-based trade routes that those SADC countries completely depend on.
Which brings us to Section 5, the final macro impact.
Bringing all this data together tells a cohesive and, frankly, fascinating story. The hyper-local narrative frequently blames migrants for crime, yet police solve less than 24% of murders, making such claims statistically unsupported in a country with the 5th highest crime index globally. Meanwhile, the actual economic engine, represented by exports making up nearly 32% of GDP, with 91% of those African exports going straight to SADC, is deeply fragile. Enormous border operations, like deporting 500,000 people, add incredible friction to the very trade corridors keeping the economy afloat. The hyper-local realities of jobs and perceived crime are inextricably tied to the macro realities of global GDP and regional trade.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative question to ponder. Can South Africa maintain its powerful, lucrative economic leadership role across the continent while simultaneously managing these rapidly growing internal social fractures? The data shows us that the cost of this ripple effect is absolutely massive, and it's a very delicate balance.